The drill bit punched through the final layer of ice at exactly 3:47 a.m., and that's when everything went straight to hell. Nobody at the Arcturus Research Station knew it yet, but they'd just cracked open a tomb that had been sealed shut for longer than human civilization had existed. Dr. Marcus Webb stood in the drilling chamber, watching the readouts on his monitor spike like crazy, showing a massive hollow cavity beneath them that shouldn't exist according to every geological survey they'd run for the past 8 months. The 42-year-old geologist from Minnesota had spent half his life chasing discoveries in the frozen wastelands of northern Alaska, but nothing had ever made his hands shake quite like this. "Holy crap, Marcus, you seeing what I'm seeing?" Jake Patterson called out from across the room, his breath forming clouds in the refrigerated air of the facility. The young engineer from Texas had joined the expedition fresh out of grad school, all enthusiasm and cowboy attitude, but even his usual bravado couldn't hide the tremor of excitement in his voice. The monitors showed a cavity stretching hundreds of feet in every direction, perfectly preserved beneath a glacier that dated back to the last ice age and then some. Temperature sensors were going bonkers, registering fluctuations that made zero sense considering they were measuring a space that had been frozen solid for millennia. Marcus grabbed the radio clip to his parka, his fingers fumbling with the cold. "Dale, you're gonna want to get down here right now. We've got something big." Dr. Dale Richardson, the expedition leader and a hard-ass geologist from Colorado who'd been doing Arctic research since before Marcus had graduated high school, responded within seconds. His gravelly voice crackled through the speaker, raw from 30 years of smoking cigarettes he'd supposedly quit 5 years back. "Define big, Webb. I was just about to grab some rack time. Try a perfectly preserved cavity the size of a football stadium about 200 feet below us," Marcus shot back, his eyes glued to the sonar imaging that was painting a picture of something that looked almost geometric, too regular to be natural. "And Dale? The temperature readings are all over the place. Something down there is warmer than it should be." The silence on the other end of the radio stretched for a good 5 seconds before Dale's voice came back, "All business now. Don't touch anything else. I'm grabbing the team." Within 20 minutes, the main drilling facility had turned into controlled chaos. Dr. Emily Morrison, the team's biologist from Oregon, stood huddled over a separate monitor, her red hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that had seen better days. She'd been analyzing the atmospheric samples the drill had pulled up from the cavity, and her face had gone pale in a way that made Marcus's stomach drop. "Guys, we've got organic compounds in these samples. Complex ones. And something else I can't quite identify yet, but it's setting off every alarm bell in my head." "Organic as in what, exactly?" Dale demanded, his weathered face creased with concern as he shouldered past the small crowd that had gathered. The rest of the 12-person research team had trickled in, roused from sleep or pulled from their various stations throughout the facility. Among them was Tommy Chin, wait, scratch that, Tommy Bradley, the station's communications officer from New York, already filming everything on his phone despite Dale's repeated warnings about protocol. Lisa Ramirez, their medical doctor from Arizona, stood near the back, her dark eyes sharp and assessing as she watched Emily work. "Organic as in this stuff was alive once, maybe still is in some kind of suspended state," Emily said, her voice tight. "I'm talking cellular structures that look almost like, look, I need more time to be sure, but this is unprecedented. Whatever's down there, it's been preserved in a perfect anaerobic environment. No oxygen, no bacterial decay, nothing. It's like finding a time capsule that nature itself sealed up." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures. "So what's the call, Dale? Do we go down?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing, and he could see the calculation happening behind Dale's eyes. This was the kind of discovery that made careers, the stuff that landed you speaking gigs and book deals and tenure at whatever university you wanted. But it was also the kind of thing that could go sideways in 100 different ways. Dale didn't hesitate long. "We go down. But we do it by the book. full contamination protocols, sealed environment suits, the whole 9 yards. Emily, I want you running point on biological safety. Lisa, you're on medical standby. Marcus, Jake, you two figure out the safest way to get us down there without compromising the integrity of the cavity. He turned to address the whole room, his voice carrying that command authority that came from decades of leading expeditions into places that didn't forgive mistakes. And I don't want word one of this leaving this facility until we know what we're dealing with. Tommy, that means you keep that phone in your pocket. We clear? The team scattered to their assignments, and the next 6 hours were a blur of preparation that moved with the efficient urgency of professionals who knew their jobs. Marcus and Jake worked out a descent plan using their existing drill shaft, widening it just enough to accommodate a reinforced cable system that could lower a person in a modified exploration suit. The suits themselves were marvels of engineering, designed for deep ice core sampling in potentially hazardous environments, complete with their own air supply, heating elements, and enough redundant safety features to make even the most paranoid engineer happy. By 11:15 a.m., they were ready. The team selected for the initial descent consisted of Dale, Marcus, Emily, and a guy named Brett Sullivan, their geophysicist from Montana who had experience with cave exploration and the kind of nerves that didn't rattle easy. The 4 of them suited up in the prep room while the rest of the team monitored from the control station. Lisa checked each of them over with a medical scanner, making them promise to report any weird symptoms, no matter how minor. I mean it, Dale, she said, pointing a finger at the expedition leader. You feel dizzy, nauseous, short of breath, anything, you call it out. I don't care if you think you're tough enough to push through it. Down there isn't the place to play hero. Dale grunted his agreement, but Marcus caught the slight smile tugging at the corner of the older man's mouth. Lisa had been on 3 expeditions with Dale and had learned that the only way to manage him was to be more stubborn than he was. The descent into the shaft was nerve-wracking even though Marcus had done similar drops before. The cable lowered them one at a time into the narrow tunnel the drill had carved through ancient ice, the walls glittering in the light from their helmet lamps. The temperature gauge on Marcus's heads-up display showed a steady -40 degrees Fahrenheit, about what he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the way the ice changed as they went deeper, the color shifting from the usual cloudy white to something clearer, more crystalline, almost like glass. Anyone else noticing the ice structure changing? Emily's voice crackled through the suit radio, tinged with scientific fascination. This doesn't match any formation pattern I've studied. It's too perfect, almost artificial. Not artificial, Brett chimed in, his voice calm and analytical. But definitely unusual. I'm seeing what looks like rapid flash freezing on a massive scale. Whatever happened here, it happened fast. Real fast. We're talking a temperature drop of hundreds of degrees in maybe hours or days. Marcus's boots hit solid surface after a descent that felt like it took forever, but his suit computer logged at 8 minutes and 43 seconds. He stepped aside to let the cable retrieve and lower the next person, sweeping his helmet lamp around to get his first real look at the cavity they'd broken into. The beam of light seemed to get swallowed up by the sheer vastness of the space, but what he could see made his breath catch in his throat. They were standing in what looked like a city. Not a modern city, not even a medieval one, but something ancient and alien and utterly impossible. Structures rose from the ice floor around them, built from some kind of dark stone that his geologist brain couldn't immediately identify. The architecture was all wrong, with angles that seemed to shift when he looked at them directly in proportions that were just off enough to be deeply unsettling. Some of the buildings were small, maybe 10 feet tall, while others towered up into the darkness beyond his light's reach. And everything, every single surface, was covered in a thin layer of that same crystalline ice that had marked the descent. Sweet Jesus, Dale breathed as he touched down beside Marcus, and that was saying something because the old man wasn't much for religious expressions. Emily and Brett arrived in quick succession, and for a long moment, the 4 of them just stood there, trying to process what they were looking at. This isn't possible, Emily finally said, but she was already moving toward the nearest structure, her scientific curiosity overriding her shock. The ice sheet here is dated to at least 12,000 years old, maybe older. Human civilization didn't have anything like this 12,000 years ago. We were barely figuring out agriculture. Then maybe it's not human, Brett suggested, his tone making it unclear if he was joking or not. He had his own instruments out, scanning the structures and the surrounding ice. Or maybe every history book we've got is missing one hell of a chapter. Marcus forced himself to move, to start doing the job they'd come down here to do. He approached one of the smaller structures, noting the way the doorway, because that's definitely what it was, had been sealed with more of that crystalline ice. Through the translucent barrier, he could make out shapes inside, things that might have been furniture or equipment or something else entirely. His hand was reaching for the ice pick on his belt before his brain caught up with what he was doing. "Hold up," Dale's voice cracked like a whip across the radio. "We don't break anything, we don't open anything, until Emily clears it." "Emily, what's your contamination read?" Emily had a handheld scanner out, waving it around like a divining rod. "Atmosphere is still showing minimal oxygen, high nitrogen, trace gases I'm still identifying. No immediate biological hazards detected, but that doesn't mean much. If there's something frozen in there, we won't know until it thaws. My recommendation is we survey and document first, then set up a controlled thaw environment for anything we want to examine." It was the smart call, the safe call, and Marcus knew it even as every instinct in his body screamed at him to smash through that ice and see what secrets this impossible city held. They spent the next 3 hours doing exactly what Emily suggested, moving through the cavity, the city, with methodical precision, documenting everything with cameras and scanners and old-fashioned notebooks. The place was bigger than they'd initially thought, stretching out in all directions with streets and structures that suggested a population that must have numbered in the thousands at least. And everywhere they looked, they found them. Bodies. Perfectly preserved in the ice, frozen in place like some grotesque art installation, were the former inhabitants of this city. They were humanoid, close enough to human that it made Marcus's skin crawl, but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall, with proportions that were stretched out. Hands that had too many fingers. Faces that were almost right but not quite, like looking at a picture that was slightly out of focus. Most of them were frozen in what looked like panic, their faces twisted in expressions of terror, bodies positioned as if they'd been running when the ice caught them. "What the hell happened here?" Jake's voice came through the radio from the surface station, where he and the others were monitoring the video feeds from the team's helmet cameras. "This is like Pompeii, but with ice instead of ash." "That's not a bad comparison," Brett said, kneeling next to one of the frozen figures. "Some kind of catastrophic flash freeze event. But I've got no idea what could cause something like this. It goes against everything we know about how ice ages work. This was sudden, violent, and localized to this area." Emily was scanning another cluster of bodies, these ones piled up against what looked like it might have been some kind of public building. "I'm getting those weird organic readings again, stronger near the bodies. And something else, there's activity. Minimal, but it's there. Cellular-level activity in some of these specimens." The words sent a jolt of ice water down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Activity? Emily, these things have been frozen for thousands of years. How can there be any kind of activity?" "I don't know." Emily's voice was sharp with frustration and barely suppressed excitement. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. It's like the cells are dormant but not dead. Hibernating, maybe? I've seen something similar in certain extremophile bacteria, but never in anything this complex. Never in anything that's basically a multicellular organism on the scale of a human being." Dale made the call to pull back and regroup, and Marcus couldn't say he was disappointed. The weight of the discovery was starting to press down on him, the implications of what they'd found making his head spin. They ascended back to the station in the same order they'd gone down, each lost in their own thoughts. The debrief in the main conference room was subdued, everyone trying to wrap their minds around the fact that they'd just found evidence of a pre-human civilization that shouldn't exist. "We need to report this," Lisa said, her practical nature cutting through the stunned silence. "This is way beyond our scope. We need experts, we need resources, we need to be careful," Dale interrupted, his weathered face thoughtful. "Lisa, you're right that this is bigger than us. But if we go off half-cocked and report some crazy story about an ancient ice city before we have solid evidence, we'll be laughed out of the scientific community. We document, we gather samples, we build an airtight case, and then we report. We do this right." Tommy Bradley, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up from his spot near the communications array. "Dale, man, I get what you're saying, but we're sitting on the discovery of the century here. Maybe the millennium. How long are we supposed to sit on this?" "As long as it takes to do it right," Dale said firmly. "We're scientists, not treasure hunters. We work the problem, we follow the evidence, and we don't rush." "Agreed?" There were murmurs of agreement around the room, some more reluctant than others, but everyone fell in line. That was the thing about Dale Richardson, when he laid down the law, people listened. They spent the rest of the day analyzing the data they'd collected, and the more Marcus looked at it, the weirder it got. The architecture didn't match any known culture or civilization. The bodies showed biological markers that were close to human but divergent in ways that suggested either a different evolutionary path or something else entirely. The ice itself was a mystery wrapped in an enigma, formed through a process that couldn't happen according to conventional understanding of thermodynamics and glaciology. It was Emily who found the first real clue, working late into the evening in the station's makeshift biology lab. Marcus had wandered in around 10 p.m., unable to sleep, to find her staring at a computer screen with the kind of intensity that usually preceded either a breakthrough or a breakdown. "Emily? You okay?" She looked up, her eyes red from hours of staring at data. "Marcus, come look at this. I've been analyzing the cellular samples from the ice near the bodies, trying to figure out what's causing the activity readings. And I found something. It's a virus, or something like a virus. Microscopic, incredibly resilient, and apparently able to survive in a dormant state in frozen conditions indefinitely." Marcus peered at the screen, which showed what looked like a spiky sphere magnified thousands of times. It looked almost crystalline itself, with geometric precision that seemed too perfect to be natural. A virus that can survive being frozen for thousands of years? That's not unprecedented, right? I've read about scientists reviving ancient viruses from permafrost. Yeah, but those viruses didn't show this kind of complexity, and they sure as hell weren't actively interacting with their host cells while still frozen, Emily said, pulling up another screen that showed cellular imagery Marcus couldn't quite parse. "This thing is doing something to the cells it infects. It's preserving them, keeping them in a state of suspended animation. And there's more. I ran the viral DNA through our database, just out of curiosity. It's not related to anything on record. Not even close. This is something completely novel." The implications hit Marcus like a freight train. "You're saying this virus is what kept those bodies preserved? That it's some kind of natural cryogenic agent?" "I'm saying it's a possibility. But here's the thing that's keeping me up: if this virus preserved the cells, and those cells are still showing activity, what happens when they warm up? When the ice melts? Do those cells wake up?" Emily's voice had dropped to almost a whisper, and Marcus could see genuine fear lurking behind her scientific fascination. Before he could respond, the station's emergency alarm blared to life, a harsh klaxon that sent both of them jumping to their feet. Dale's voice boomed through the PA system, tight with urgency. "Everyone to the drilling chamber, now! We've got a situation." Marcus and Emily ran through the corridors of the station, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. The drilling chamber was in chaos when they arrived, with Jake and Brett working frantically at the controls while Dale barked orders. The monitors were showing a massive spike in temperature readings from the cavity below, and the seismic sensors were registering movement. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus demanded, shouldering up to the control panel. The numbers didn't make sense. The cavity temperature had jumped from -40 to just below freezing and was still rising, despite the fact that they hadn't introduced any external heat sources. "Something's melting the ice down there," Jake said, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he tried to pull up different camera angles. "About 20 minutes ago, the temperature just started climbing. In the movement, we're picking up vibrations, rhythmic ones, like something walking or what?" Dale snapped. Jake swallowed hard. "Or a lot of somethings walking. The pattern's too regular to be geological activity." Emily grabbed Marcus's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "The virus. If the temperature's rising, if the ice is melting, the cells would wake up. And if those things down there are infected, if the virus is what preserved them." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Lisa arrived with Tommy right behind her, both looking disheveled from sleep. "Someone want to tell me why we're having a fire drill at damn near midnight?" "It's not a drill," Dale said grimly. "We've got activity in the cavity. Significant activity. And the temperature is rising on its own, which shouldn't be possible." He turned to Marcus and Jake. "Can we seal the shaft? Block whatever's down there from coming up?" Marcus was already running calculations in his head. "We can try, but the drill created a pretty wide opening. It'd take hours to set up a proper seal, and that's assuming we have the materials. Best we could do is..." The main monitor flickered, then resolved into an image from one of the cameras they'd left in the cavity. What it showed made every person in the room go silent. The ice that had encased the structures and bodies was melting rapidly, running in rivers across the stone floor. And the bodies were moving. Not the twitchy, spastic movements of something waking from a long sleep, but deliberate, coordinated motion. One of the frozen figures lurched to its feet, ice still clinging to its elongated limbs, and turned to face the camera. Its eyes, which had been closed in death or sleep, snapped open, revealing milky white orbs that seemed to glow with their own internal light. The creature's mouth opened, wider than any human mouth should open, and even through the silent video feed, Marcus could imagine the sound it must be making. "Holy Mother of God," Tommy breathed, his phone out and recording despite the circumstances. "Are those things alive?" "Undead might be more accurate," Emily said, her voice hollow. "The virus is reanimating the preserved tissue. This is what it was designed to do, or what it evolved to do. It's not just preserving the cells, it's hijacking them, using them." More of the figures were rising now, dozens of them visible on the various camera feeds, all moving with that same jerky but purposeful gait. They seemed drawn to the drill shaft, congregating around the opening that led up to the station. Brett pulled up the seismic data again, his face pale. "There's more. Way more. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all starting to move. The whole damn city is waking up." Dale was already in motion, his leadership instincts kicking in. "Lisa, inventory every weapon we have. I don't care if it's a flare gun or a fire axe, I want to know about it. Tommy, get on the satellite uplink and send a distress signal to Anchorage. Tell them we have a biological containment breach and need immediate evacuation. Jake, Brett, you're with Marcus. Figure out how to slow those things down." "What about me?" Emily asked, though she looked like she already knew the answer. "You figure out how to kill that virus," Dale said bluntly. "Because if those things are infected with it, and they get out of this facility, we're looking at a containment scenario that makes every pandemic in history look like a mild cold. We need a countermeasure, and we need it yesterday." The next hour was a blur of frantic activity as the team worked to prepare for what was coming. Marcus, Jake, and Brett rigged up a system using spare drilling equipment and fuel from the generators, creating what amounted to a massive blowtorch they could lower into the shaft. The theory was that extreme heat might succeed where the cold had failed, potentially destroying the viral agent and the creatures it animated. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. Lisa's inventory was depressingly sparse. The station had a few flare guns, some tools that could serve as improvised weapons, and a single shotgun that the previous team had left behind for polar bear protection. Not exactly an arsenal capable of holding off a horde of undead ancient humanoids. Tommy's attempt to reach Anchorage was meeting with frustration. The satellite uplink was functional, but he was getting nothing but static on the emergency frequencies. "It's like something's jamming the signal," he said, adjusting the equipment for the 5th time. "Or the storm that's rolling in is already screwing with our transmission. Either way, I can't get a clear signal out." "Keep trying," Dale ordered, then turned his attention to the main monitor. The creatures had reached the base of the shaft and were looking up at it with those unsettling glowing eyes. One of them reached out with its 2 long fingers and touched the ice wall, and where it made contact, the ice began to melt rapidly. "They're generating heat somehow. That's what's melting the ice. Emily, does that fit with your virus theory?" Emily looked up from her microscope, her face drawn. "It could. If the virus is metabolically active, it might be producing heat as a byproduct. Or it could be intentional, a mechanism to help it spread by melting the ice and freeing more hosts. This thing is frighteningly sophisticated for something we're calling a virus. It's almost like it's intelligently designed." "You're saying someone made this?" Brett asked, incredulous. "I'm saying it's too efficient, too perfectly adapted to its environment and purpose, to be a random mutation. Either it was engineered or it's been evolving toward this specific function for a very long time. Either option is terrifying." The creatures began to climb. Their elongated fingers and toes found purchase in the smallest cracks in the ice, and they ascended with a speed and agility that was deeply unnatural. Marcus watched on the monitors, his hands clenched into fists, as the first of them reached the halfway point of the shaft. "Dale, if we're going to use the torch, it has to be now, before they get too close." Dale nodded sharply. "Do it." Jake activated the system, and superheated flame roared down the shaft, turning the narrow tunnel into a blast furnace. The cameras showed the creatures caught in the inferno, their bodies blackening and burning. For a moment, Marcus dared to hope it would work. Then the burning bodies just kept climbing. The fire was consuming their flesh, melting it away from the bone, but they didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. "They're not dying," Lisa said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Why aren't they dying?" "The virus is keeping them animated even as the tissue is destroyed," Emily said, horrified fascination in her voice. "It's in the bones, maybe even integrated with the skeletal structure. As long as that's intact, they keep going. We're not dealing with reanimated corpses. We're dealing with something that's more virus than host at this point." Marcus made a decision that he knew might doom them all but saw no alternative to. "Collapse the shaft. If we can't kill them, we bury them. Bring down enough ice and rock, and even if they can't die, they won't be able to move." "That could destabilize the entire station," Brett protested. "We set off charges big enough to collapse that shaft, we might bring the whole facility down on our heads." "Then we evacuate first," Dale said, already moving toward the equipment lockers. "Everyone grabs emergency supplies and suits up. We make for the backup shelter 3 clicks north. Once we're clear, we blow the charges and bring this whole damned place down. It's the only way to make sure those things don't get out." The team moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd trained for emergencies, even if they'd never trained for this specific nightmare. Emergency packs were distributed, containing survival gear, rations, and heating elements that could keep a person alive in the Arctic for days if necessary. The backup shelter was a small prefab structure they'd erected when first setting up the station, designed as a safe haven in case the main facility was compromised. Marcus was helping Emily pack up her critical research samples when the lights flickered. Once, twice, then died completely, plunging the station into darkness broken only by the red emergency lighting that clicked on automatically. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately. The fact that it didn't was a very bad sign. "Tommy, what's the status on the generator?" Dale called out, his voice calm despite the circumstances. There was a pause, then Tommy's voice came back, shaky. "It's not responding. And guys, I'm in the comm room, and I can hear something in the walls. Something moving." The temperature in the drilling chamber had been rising steadily, Marcus realized. They'd been so focused on the threat from below that they hadn't noticed the facility itself was heating up. The creatures were melting the ice around the station's foundation, using that same unnatural heat they'd demonstrated in the shaft. And if they could melt through the walls? They're already inside, Marcus said, the certainty of it settling over him like a weight. They didn't need to climb the shaft. They melted through the exterior ice and came up through the floor. They're in the station with us. As if to confirm his words, a section of the floor at the far end of the chamber buckled and cracked. Ice and metal shrieked as they tore apart, and pale, elongated fingers emerged from the gap, pulling at the edges to widen the opening. The emergency lights cast everything in shades of red, making the scene look even more hellish as the first of the creatures hauled itself up into the station. It was one of the burned ones from the shaft, its flesh mostly gone, leaving exposed bone and sinew that glowed with that same internal light. Bits of the viral ice seemed to have replaced the missing tissue, crystalline structures filling in the gaps and holding the thing together. Its eyeless skull turned toward the team, and Marcus could swear the thing saw them despite lacking any obvious sensory organs. Lisa raised the shotgun with steady hands and fired, the blast deafening in the confined space. The shot took the creature in the chest, shattering ribs and punching a hole clean through its torso. It staggered back a step, looked down at the damage, then continued forward. Lisa fired again, and again, each shot doing visible damage but failing to stop the thing's advance. The head. Emily shouted. Destroy the brain, sever the connection between the virus and the motor functions. Lisa adjusted her aim and fired her last shot, catching the creature squarely in the skull. The bone exploded in a shower of fragments and that weird crystalline ice-virus hybrid, and the creature finally dropped, collapsing in a heap of disjointed bones. But 4 more were already climbing through the hole, and cracks were appearing in other parts of the floor. The station was compromised, and there was no time for a controlled evacuation. Run! Dale roared, and the team didn't need to be told twice. They fled through the corridors of the station, the sound of tearing metal and cracking ice following them. Marcus grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her along as they ran. Behind them, he could hear Lisa chambering shells into the shotgun, buying them time with each blast. Tommy was ahead of them, his phone still in his hand, still recording everything with the instinct of someone who needed to document the truth even in the face of death. The exterior door to the station was sealed against the Arctic cold, and precious seconds ticked by as Jake worked the manual release. The sound of pursuit was getting closer, the creatures moving through the station with terrifying speed. The door finally gave way, and Arctic wind blasted into the corridor, carrying with it snow and cold that felt almost welcoming compared to what was behind them. They stumbled out into the perpetual twilight of the Arctic summer night, the sky a deep purple blue that provided just enough light to see by. The backup shelter was a dark shape in the distance, and they ran toward it across the ice, their boots slipping and sliding. Marcus chanced to look back and immediately wished he hadn't. The station was crawling with the creatures, dozens of them emerging from every opening, their glowing eyes creating a constellation of unnatural light. Brett went down hard, his foot catching on a ridge of ice. Marcus and Jake doubled back, hauling him to his feet even as the creatures closed the distance. One of them got close enough that Marcus could feel the heat radiating off it, could see the details of how the viral ice had restructured its body into something that was part organic, part crystalline, all wrong. He swung the ice axe he'd grabbed on the way out, catching the thing in the neck and decapitating it with a lucky blow. It fell, but 2 more took its place. They made the shelter in a desperate, final sprint, piling through the door and slamming it shut behind them. The structure was small, designed for maybe 6 people in an emergency, and it felt claustrophobic with all 12 of them crammed inside. Dale immediately started securing the entrance, reinforcing it with everything they could move, while Lisa did a quick head count. Everyone had made it, though Brett was limping badly, and Tommy had a gash on his forehead that was bleeding freely. Emily, Lisa, see to the wounded, Dale ordered. Everyone else, inventory what we've got and prep for siege conditions. We're not getting out of here until help arrives or we figure out how to kill those things permanently. The shelter's small windows showed the creatures surrounding them, not attacking but waiting, their numbers growing by the minute as more emerged from the ruined station. Marcus helped Jake set up the shelter's radio, a more powerful unit than the one in the station, and tried to raise anyone, on the emergency frequencies. He got nothing but static and what might have been interference or might have been something else, a sound almost like whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Emily had her portable lab equipment out, still working on the viral samples even in these desperate circumstances. "I might have something," she said after an hour of tense silence broken only by the wind and the occasional thump against the shelter's walls. "The virus is vulnerable to specific frequencies of UV radiation. Not the natural kind, but a concentrated, artificial wavelength. If we could generate enough of it, we might be able to denature the viral proteins, kill it at the source." "And where exactly are we supposed to get a UV generator in the middle of the Arctic?" Tommy asked, though his tone was more desperate than sarcastic. "The station had UV sterilization units in the biology lab," Emily said. "If they survived the breach, if we could get back in there." It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. But it was also the only option that offered any hope beyond waiting to freeze or be overrun. Marcus found himself volunteering before his brain had fully processed the decision. "I'll go. I know the station layout, and I'm faster than most of you." "No offense." "I'm coming with you," Jake said immediately. "You'll need someone to watch your back, and I know the electrical systems. If those UV units need to be modified or jury-rigged, I'm your best bet." Dale looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew the logic was sound. "You've got 2 hours. If you're not back by then, we're assuming you're not coming back, and we figure out Plan B. God help us all if there is no Plan B." Marcus and Jake suited up, checking their equipment with meticulous care. They had a flare gun, 2 ice axes, and a flashlight that seemed woefully inadequate for what they were about to attempt. Before they left, Emily pressed a small device into Marcus's hand. "It's a UV tester. If you find the sterilization units, this will tell you if they're still functional. And Marcus? Be careful. We need you to come back." The journey back to the station was a nightmare of stealth and speed, moving between cover points while the creatures wandered the ice in seemingly random patterns. Up close, Marcus could see that they weren't all the same. Some were the burned skeletal things from the shaft, but others were fresher, their flesh still mostly intact but transformed by the virus into something that looked like flesh-toned ice. Those ones were somehow worse, their faces still recognizable as having once been human-ish, twisted into expressions of mindless hunger. They made it to a secondary entrance on the station's east side, a maintenance access that was half buried in snow. The creatures hadn't breached it yet, and the door still functioned, sliding open with a whisper of hydraulics. Inside, the station was a maze of darkness and sporadic emergency lighting, shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't move. Marcus could hear them in the walls, in the floors, a constant skittering and scraping that set his teeth on edge. The biology lab was in the central hub of the facility, which meant navigating through 3 corridors and past the main common area. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals, freezing whenever they heard movement. Twice they had to hide, pressing themselves into darkened side rooms while creatures passed within feet of them, that unnatural heat making Marcus's skin prickle even through his insulated suit. They made it to the biology lab to find it surprisingly intact, Emily's hasty evacuation having left the space messy but functional. The UV sterilization units were right where they should be, mounted on the wall near the decontamination chamber. Jake immediately set to work disconnecting them, while Marcus kept watch at the door, his ice axe gripped in white-knuckled hands. "Got them," Jake whispered after what felt like hours but was probably only 5 minutes. "Both units are functional, and I think I can rig them to run off our portable power cells. It won't last long, but it should generate enough UV to test Emily's theory." The return journey started smoothly enough. They retraced their route, moving with the confidence of success within reach. That's probably why they got careless, why Marcus didn't notice the creature waiting in the shadowed alcove until it lunged at him. He went down hard, the ice axe skittering from his grip, the creature's weight pinning him as its face, a nightmare of crystalline flesh and glowing eyes, descended toward his throat. Jake saved his life, bringing a piece of metal conduit down on the creature's skull with enough force to crack it like an eggshell. The thing spasmed and went still, and Marcus scrambled out from under it, his heart hammering. "Thanks, man. I owe you one. Buy me a beer if we survive this, and we'll call it even," Jake replied, but his attempt at humor was undercut by the shaking in his hands. The noise of the fight had attracted attention, and they could hear more of the creatures converging on their location. They ran, abandoning stealth for speed, racing through the corridors with the UV units clutched to their chests like precious cargo. They burst out of the station into the Arctic air with at least a dozen creatures in pursuit, the things moving with that awful inhuman speed. The run back to the shelter was desperate, all out, the kind of effort that burned muscles and lungs. Marcus's legs were screaming by the time the shelter came into view, Dale already opening the door, shotgun in hand to provide cover fire. They practically fell through the entrance, and Dale slammed it shut behind them, the sound of bodies impacting the metal a second later. But they'd made it. They had the UV units, and Emily was already examining them with an expert eye, nodding as Jake explained his plan for powering them. "It's going to work," she said, and there was hope in her voice for the first time since this nightmare began. "We set these up to create an overlapping field of UV radiation. Anything infected with the virus that walks into it should be neutralized. We can clear a path back to the communications array, get a signal out, call for help with proper containment protocols." It took another hour to set everything up, to test and retest Emily's theory on the small viral samples she had. And it worked. Under the UV light, the virus broke down, the crystalline structures dissolving, the cellular activity ceasing. When they applied it to a small piece of tissue from one of the creatures, the same thing happened. The flesh decayed rapidly, returning to the state it should have been in after millennia of being frozen. They rigged the UV units to portable frames, creating what amounted to 2 UV floodlights that could bathe an area in sterilizing radiation. The plan was simple in concept if terrifying in execution: create a corridor of UV light back to the station's communications array, make the call for help, and then hunker down until extraction arrived. Dale, Marcus, and Lisa volunteered for the mission, each carrying one of the UV units while the others provided what support they could from the shelter. Stepping back out into the Arctic night with the creatures all around them was one of the hardest things Marcus had ever done, but he forced himself forward, trusting in Emily's science. The effect was immediate and dramatic. When the UV light hit the creatures, they reacted like vampires in old movies, their flesh smoking and dissolving. They didn't die quietly, though. They shrieked, a sound that was like nothing Marcus had ever heard, a combination of radio static and human screaming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But they fell back, unable to withstand the radiation, creating a clear path. The journey to the communications array was tense but successful. The creatures learned quickly, staying just outside the range of the UV lights, pacing them but not attacking. Marcus kept expecting the lights to fail, for the power cells to die at the worst possible moment, but Jake's engineering held. They reached the communications room, and Dale set to work on the radio while Marcus and Lisa kept the lights trained on the entrances. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Arcturus Research Station Alpha." Dale's voice was crisp and professional despite everything they'd been through. "We have a catastrophic biological containment breach. Repeat, biological containment breach. We need immediate evacuation and hazmat response. Any station, please respond." For a long, horrible moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice crackled through, rough with distance but beautifully human. "Arcturus Station, this is Elmendorf Response Command. We read you. What's the nature of your emergency?" Dale explained, keeping it clinical, knowing that if he let the full horror of it seep into his voice, they might think he'd lost his mind. He described the cavity, the frozen city, the creatures, the virus. To their credit, the response team didn't laugh or dismiss him. They asked questions, requested data, and ultimately made the call to dispatch an emergency extraction team with full biological containment capabilities. "ETA is 8 hours, the voice said. "Can you hold up that long?" Dale looked at Marcus and Lisa, saw the exhaustion and determination in their faces, and keyed the radio again. "We'll hold. Just get here fast." and come prepared for a hot extraction. These things won't go down easy. The journey back to the shelter was easier, now that they knew the UV worked, now that help was coming. The team's mood lifted considerably when they returned with the news of the incoming extraction. 8 hours felt manageable, survivable. They took turns on watch, maintaining the UV perimeter while the others rested and tried to process what they'd been through. Emily spent the time documenting everything, her scientific instincts insisting that there had to be a record of this, that the world needed to know what they'd found even if it terrified her. Marcus found himself sitting next to her as she worked, watching her sketch the creatures and their viral structures with steady hands. "You think this is what wiped them out?" he asked quietly. "The civilization down there? Their own virus turned against them?" "Maybe," Emily said, not looking up from her work. "Or maybe it was a weapon, something they created or something that was used against them. That flash freeze event, the panic in how they died, it could have been a last-ditch effort to contain an outbreak. Freeze the whole city, everything in it, to stop the virus from spreading. And we just let it out," Marcus said, the guilt of it sitting heavy in his stomach. "We didn't know," Emily said firmly, finally meeting his eyes. "We couldn't have known. And maybe it's better that we found it now, in a controlled environment, rather than having it melt out on its own in a few years as the climate warms. At least now we have a chance to study it, to understand it, to prepare for it." The 8 hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, punctuated by moments of terror when the creatures tested their defenses, seeking weaknesses. But the UV perimeter held, and when the sound of helicopters finally cut through the Arctic wind, Marcus could have cried with relief. The extraction team was military, not civilian, which should have surprised Marcus more than it did. They came in with full hazmat gear and weapons that were definitely not standard scientific equipment, establishing a secure perimeter around the shelter with brutal efficiency. A gruff lieutenant named Garrett took Dale's report, his face betraying nothing as he listened to the impossible story. "We're going to airlift you out to Elmendorf," Garrett said once Dale finished. "The whole site is being quarantined, and a containment team will be here within 24 hours to deal with the cavity and whatever's in it. You and your people will be held in medical isolation for 72 hours, standard protocol for potential exposure to unknown biological agents. After that, assuming you're clear, you'll be debriefed and released." The flight out was a blur of exhaustion and relief, the team crammed into the helicopter's cargo space, watching through the windows as the station and the shelter shrank into the distance. Marcus could see the creatures gathered around both structures, drawn by the heat and movement and life they represented, unaware or uncaring that their brief freedom was about to be ended with extreme prejudice. The isolation period was difficult in its own way, each of them confined to separate rooms in a military medical facility, subjected to endless tests and examinations. But none of them showed signs of infection, and the virus couldn't survive in their bodies without the unique conditions of the frozen cavity. Emily was proven right on that count, the virus was adapted to its specific environment and couldn't function outside of it. The debriefing that followed was intense, each team member questioned separately and together, their stories recorded and analyzed for inconsistencies. Marcus got the sense that the military had been aware of the possibility of something like this, that they'd been preparing for the discovery of ancient biological threats in melting permafrost. What they hadn't expected was a whole civilization and a virus that could reanimate the dead. 2 weeks after the extraction, Marcus was finally released and allowed to return to his normal life, though normal felt like a word that no longer applied. The experience had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. The military made it clear that everything related to the discovery was classified, that discussing it publicly would result in consequences they didn't need to specify. The story given to the academic community was that Arcturus Station had suffered a catastrophic equipment failure and had to be evacuated. Everyone bought it. Why wouldn't they? But Marcus knew the truth. Somewhere in the Arctic, in a cavity beneath the ice, a frozen city waited with its undying inhabitants. The military had sealed it, or so they claimed, but he'd seen the creatures, seen their resilience. He wondered sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, if the seal would hold. If future generations would have to deal with the legacy of what they'd found. If the virus was truly contained or if it was just waiting, patient as only something that had survived for millennia could be patient. He kept in touch with the others from the team, a shared trauma bonding them in ways that ordinary friendship couldn't. They met occasionally, carefully avoiding any discussion of the classified details when anyone might be listening, but finding comfort in the presence of people who understood, who'd seen the same impossible things. Emily continued her research, though she'd been forced to destroy all her samples from the cavity. She focused instead on extremophile organisms and viral preservation in frozen environments, her work suddenly getting a lot more funding from sources she couldn't disclose. Marcus suspected the military wanted her expertise, wanted to understand what they'd found even if they could never talk about it publicly. A year after the incident, Marcus was approached by a man in a nondescript suit who identified himself only as being from a government agency concerned with such matters. The man asked him if he'd be willing to consult on future discoveries of a similar nature, to provide his expertise if they encountered other frozen cavities, other impossible finds. Marcus said yes. How could he not? He'd seen what was out there, what might be waiting to be found as the world warmed and the ice gave up its secrets. There are more of them, aren't there? Marcus asked the man before he left. More frozen cities, more viruses, more things that shouldn't exist. The man's expression didn't change. The world is old, Dr. Webb. Much older than our civilization. And the ice has been preserving things for a very long time. Let's just say that your discovery at Arcturus isn't unique. And leave it at that. Marcus thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, thought about the implications of a world where ancient horrors slept beneath the ice, waiting for the warmth to wake them. He thought about the creatures with their glowing eyes and crystalline flesh, about the city that had been frozen in an instant of cataclysmic terror. And he wondered what else was out there, what other nightmares were preserved in the frozen places of the world, counting down the years until the ice melted and set them free. But for now, the immediate threat was contained. The team had survived. And somewhere in a classified facility, scientists were working on understanding the virus, on developing countermeasures in case it ever appeared again. It wasn't a happy ending, not really. But it was better than the alternative. It was survival, and in the face of what they'd encountered, survival felt like a victory worth celebrating. Marcus went back to his research, his teaching, his normal life. But he never forgot those hours in the frozen city, never forgot the lesson they'd learned the hard way, that the past doesn't always stay buried, that sometimes the dead don't rest, and that humanity's greatest discoveries often come with a price written in terror and blood and the cold, patient hunger of things that should have stayed frozen forever. The story of Arcturus Station would never be told to the world, but those who lived it would carry it with them always, a secret nightmare that reminded them how thin the line was between the known and the unknown, between the safety of the present and the hungry horrors of the ancient past. And somewhere in the Arctic darkness, beneath tons of ice and military-grade containment, the city waited. The creatures waited. The virus waited. Patient. Undying. And the world turned on, unaware of how close it had come to facing something that could have ended everything, saved only by the courage of 12 researchers and the desperate hope that the ice would hold, that the seals would last, that the past would stay buried just a little while longer. That was the real horror, Marcus realized. Not that they'd found it, but that it was still there, and would always be there, waiting in the dark and the cold for the day when the ice finally melted and the world learned what it meant to face an enemy that couldn't die, wouldn't stop, and had all the time in the world.